Hey everybody! Today we're going to go over a build that I'm using that I'm calling the Bloody Summoner build. So let's get right into it. So we're going to go over the build, and then we're going to see a little gameplay, show you how it works in practice, and go from there. So, Bloody Summoner build. The first and most important piece of gear that you're going to need for this build is the Blood Letters Insignia. This ring is really what it's all about. So the crux of this build is you're going to be doing a lot of burst DPS. You're going to be doing some constant DPS. But what really makes it stand apart is that you're going to be getting heals off an awful lot of the DPS that you're doing. And that's what makes it such a good build. And the Blood Letters Insignia is really the thing that makes it all work. This is the only piece of gear I have found in this game that actually returns health to you based on how much bleed damage you have caused the enemy. And it says, the effects applied by the wearer steal 10% of the damage dealt and return it to the wearer's health. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, right? 10% may sound like a ton. But if you look at something like this weapon here, which we'll go over later, it's doing 422.5 damage normally. It's then applying a bleeding effect for 2,028 damage over 20 seconds, right? So what that means is you're getting 10% of that back. So over those 20 seconds, you're getting 202.8 of that damage returned to you as health. Now, if you look, I have 150 health. So that means over the course of 20 seconds, I will essentially overheal myself. You know, I will fill up my bar. And the important thing there is that when I do apply this bleeding effect to a boss, for instance, and he does some damage to me, you will notice in some of the gameplay that my health goes right back up because I am getting so much healing back compared to my healing pool. So, Blood Letters Insignia is absolutely one of the most, if not the most important item in this loadout. The next item that is critical is the necklace, Razor Wire Necklace. This increases the damage dealt by bleeding by 50%. And also, all your range and melee damage dealt to the enemy is increased by 15%. And this is fantastic because if we were doing, if we didn't have the Razor Wire Necklace and we were doing, say, 1,000 damage on something over 20 seconds, that means you're getting about 100 of that back over that time. You put in the Razor Wire Necklace, all of a sudden it goes up by 50%, and it's just math. You're doing more damage with bleeding, which means you are getting more health returned to you, which is fantastic. Now, I don't know about you, but I find Remnant sometimes to be a difficult game. Difficult to stay alive, difficult to heal, slow to heal, right? Blood Wart, Dragonheart, Healing Aura, they all are not instantaneous. You know, Dragonheart is about as close as it gets to being instantaneous, but your character still enters in that animation where he turns around, grabs a Dragonheart, applies it to his chest, you wait a second and a half, and then you're back up to health. You get interrupted during any of those motions, and you have to start that over again. Bloodwort is arguably even worse, because while it can return a lot of health, it takes a good period of time to work. Again, if you are knocked around while you're trying to take the Bloodwort, you have to try it again. Healing Aura is actually probably the worst of the group in terms of how quickly and easy it is to heal, because it uses a weapon mod, so it takes a little bit of time to get it recharged. You throw the thing down and you have to stand there, right? If there is a boss charging you and you throw down a healing pool, you have to stand there until you are healed enough. Yes, you can dodge in and out of it, all that stuff, but when you do that, you aren't taking healing. And another thing about the healing sources, is when you are actively healing, you are not actively doing damage. Your DPS is 0 while you're healing, which doesn't make the boss go down any faster. So the great thing about the bleeding build, the bleeding summoner build, is that you are, for all intents and purposes, doing constant damage. It's not as much as if you're shooting at somebody usually, but it's still constant damage. The boss is still going to have less health than when it started for that action that you're doing in terms of the bleeding effects. So, Bloodletter's Insignia, the one ring that you have to have. This is a non-negotiable for this build. Razor Wire Necklace is also a non-negotiable for this build. These are your two key pieces. These are both found in Rysum. The next item that I find to be critical, now and I will say a caveat to that because there is one alternative, is the Devastator Crossbow. This crossbow does some pretty good damage up front. 422.5 is what mine is at. Yours might vary based on what other kind of traits you have and armor set you have on. But it does a pretty big amount of damage right up front, and it does 300% additional stagger damage. You can stagger some bosses with this. But what makes it work for a build, clearly, is the bleeding effect. It's doing that giant amount of damage over 20 seconds. That is fantastic. So, that's 202.8 damage I am getting back as health over that 20 seconds. The one issue people are going to have with the Devastator is that it's single shot and it does not have the quickest reload. It's a few seconds, 2-3+ seconds to reload, which makes it not an ideal weapon for close range at all. So, for me to compensate for that, I use a firearm with a really high rate of fire in the handgun spot, and I'm going with a machine pistol. Now here is where I'm not going to be contributing to my bleeding build. Now you're coming to the summoner part of my build. And I know some people are going to say, well, Swarm's not an actual summon, and that's true. Swarm is not an actual summon. It does not seem to be affected by any ring or trait that you have that increases the duration of summons, but it is ideal nonetheless, and it behaves similar to a summon. So let's think about the summons that we have in the game, right? We have the Iron Sentinel. Okay, Iron Sentinel is a turret that you throw on the ground, and it has a 360-degree rotation that it can fire a steady stream of small impact bullets. And it's great because if the enemy is in front of it or around it, it's going to really just shred them. And that's fantastic. However, it is stationary. It is stationary so that if you have to run around, if the boss just runs through it, because they will try to just run through the Sentinel, the Sentinel may not be able to hit them, and then it is doing 0 DPS. It is still good, but situational. So the next weapon mod that you could use for a summon is, and let's actually pull this up here so I get the name right. Alright, I believe, there we go. It is Very Good Boy. This deals 70.4 damage per bite on the way I have things spec'd out, but you can increase it for 60 seconds, and it lasts 69 seconds, and there's one charge. So this is a decent one. It beats the Sentinel in that it will chase down the enemy, right? So if it's not like you have to worry about, oh, I dropped it over there, so I have to lead the enemy over there. No. The Very Good Boy weapon mod will go and track down the enemy, which is fantastic. It does sometimes get a mind of its own, like the next summon I want to go over, which is Beckon. Beckon is kind of like Very Good Boy in that it can roam around. It is not tied to the ground, to one specific spot. It does pretty good damage, and you get 2 of them, so that is excellent as well. It doesn't target multiple enemies at a time, though, right? It's a single enemy weapon mod, so that means it works really great against bosses, and you can use it in all situations, but it's really going to shine against, you know, bigger enemies where there's only one of them out there. Unfortunately, though, with Beckon, you can't really control where it goes, and it has a really bad habit of, after you just defeated some enemies, if there are others nearby that are within its range, even if you don't know they're there, it will just go after them. Even if you're just trying to chill for a second and heal up or do whatever you're trying to do, it's going to go after them. If it kills them, great. If it doesn't, that means those enemies are now going to be running after you. Those enemies you may not even know are there. So you have to keep an eye on this thing. You really do. But I did run with it for a long time, and it is pretty decent. The weapon mod that I have been using fairly exclusively for a quote-unquote summon is Swarm. And again, Swarm isn't a typical summon that you'll get to use any of the traits that increase summons, but it behaves like one. So when you launch it, you can direct where you want to launch it, or who you want to launch it at, which is unlike the other 3 that I mentioned. And when it's done, it typically will come back to you if there's nobody else around. But it can get a little bit of that Beckon characteristic where it will go and seek out other enemies, but it doesn't go as far as Beckon does, so it's easier to control. It's easier to understand, like, you know, what it's going to be doing. And this thing is freaking devastating. Now, you saw that, you know, Beckon had 135.2 damage. The Very Good Boy was similar. This is only 16.9 damage, and it also lasts a lot less time than Very Good Boy or Beckon did, or Iron Sentinel for that matter. But it is doing 16.9 per hit. I don't know exactly how many hits, but it is pretty high number, and it will just melt enemies. It will just melt them. And because I have it paired with a weapon with a really high fire rate, it recharges it fairly quickly. We'll actually go, I don't have the number, but we'll actually go and test it, and we'll see how quickly it recharges. Another option to the Devastator, if you don't want to use this one, is using any weapon, handgun or long gun, that has an open weapon mod spot, and then using Fan of Knives, which I must have on another weapon. But what Fan of Knives does is it's the only other weapon mod that I've seen that does bleeding damage. You will probably find some blogs or some other YouTube videos about Fan of Knives, comparing it to the Skewer weapon mod. But I'm going to tell you right now that while their straight raw math is correct, that over a period of time, Fan of Knives will outperform Skewer, not by a lot, by 10 or 20 damage, which isn't a lot to begin with. Fan of Knives suffers from the fact that it has a considerably shorter range than Skewer, and it also, as the name suggests, it goes out in a very wide range. So if you are on the move and an enemy is coming towards you and you throw Fan of Knives, you might miss with some of those knives. And there are, I think, 5 or 7 projectiles that you throw. If you do not hit with all of them, it immediately will not do as much as Skewer. So if you combine the short range with the very high chance that you are not going to land all of those knives on the target, then Skewer becomes easier choice, much easier choice. The range on Skewer is incredible, and even when you're out of the ideal range for this weapon, Skewer still does a ton of damage. So highly recommend it. If you want to try Fan of Knives, go for it. But in practice, I'm not talking theory, in practice, Skewer will definitely outperform Fan of Knives. So the other weapon that I'm using is Scar of the Jungle God, because this is the only weapon that actually by itself will apply a bleeding damage when you do a charge attack. 520 over 20 seconds. That's pretty good. If you see this is 2028 over 20 seconds, so it's about a quarter of the damage. Sure, that is not as great. However, it's just a charge attack. It's just a charge attack, so you can keep doing it over and over again. Unlike the Devastator, where you get 2 shots and then you have to recharge the weapon, this is going to be better for you over other weapons. Now, that said, there is a trick you can use. Now, what you need to do is you need to find a ring called Razor Stone. Now, I didn't mention before, but you can, and the reason I didn't cover this ring spot before is because you can actually use whatever ring you want. You really can. You really can use whatever second ring that you want. If you want something more with crit, if you want something that's going to extend the life of your summons, or you want whatever you want more healing, whatever, you can use it. However, if you want to commit yourself to a bleedy build, then you're going to want the Razor Stone, because it also, like Scar of the Jungle God, is doing 520 damage over 20 seconds. So that means a charge attack is going to do 1040 damage over 20 seconds. Now remember, there's no charge up time. This is just a weapon charge attack you can do whenever. So with this melee weapon and this ring, you're doing half as much damage as this. That's pretty impressive, right? But there's obviously it's melee range. You're not hitting anything from a distance. So if you want to maximize it, you want to use a Razor Stone. If not, then use something else and you'll still be fine. But the benefit of the Razor Stone is maybe you don't have these. Maybe you don't have Scar of the Jungle God yet. This allows you to use whatever melee weapon you want and get the same effect. So if I'm not using Scar of the Jungle God, there are 2 basic other weapons that I'm going to use. The first choice after Scar of the Jungle God is going to be World's Edge, because it releases a projectile wave on charge attack. So basically an AoE ranged attack, kind of like the Hero Sword on the World's Edge. And I do believe that when you're doing that, it will apply the bleeding effect to enemies. So that is fantastic, because that way you're not going to waste a charge off Devastator, but you're going to be able to still get bleed effects out there. Now, the reason why I didn't really hype this one up as much as Scar of the Jungle God, which is a single target melee weapon, is because by the point that you have all this gear put together, this loadout put together, enemies are going to die far too quickly for you to even get one tick of bleeding on any non-elite or non-boss weapon, boss enemy. So, yeah. Yes, you can use Scar of the Jungle God. Yes, you can use World's Edge. But you're not going to be able to get the bleeding effect off World's Edge, except for the ring if you're using Razor Stone. So besides those, the other melee weapon that I would use is Riven. This is acquired from Undying King. This is a fantastic weapon. The Scythe has such a high crit hit chance. It has a very high hit rate, and it's doing 4% of the base damage dealt coming back to you as health. You accompany this with the Razor Stone, and now the Razor Stone with Bloodletter's Insignia, which is pulling 10% of the damage back as health. This Riven on its own is doing 4%, which means if you're using Riven and you're using charge attacks, you're going to be doing about 14% of the damage that you caused. So that is pretty awesome. I will tend to use Riven if I'm in a scenario where I just really need that quick boost of health back, quicker than maybe the bleeding will get me, especially if I'm in a melee situation where I'm in a situation where I have to use melee. Then I might switch to Riven if there's more than one enemy. If there's only one enemy, I'm going to keep Scar of the Jungle God. And I know that it's not easy to change weapons. You can't exactly do it in the middle of a fight, but if you have a moment, it takes all of maybe 10 seconds to get into your inventory and change items around. Just be very careful if you're going to do that. So we've covered the rings, we've covered the necklace, we've covered the long gun, the handgun, the melee weapon. Now it's going to come time to the armor. The reason I saved the armor for last is because it almost doesn't matter what you wear. There are so many great armor sets with fantastic set bonuses that I'm not going to say you can't go wrong, but there are just a lot of options. It's however you want to accentuate the build or your playstyle. I typically prefer to go with either the Cultist set to extend the length of time that my weapon mods can be used, but usually I'm going to go with the Labyrinth armor set because it increases the damage that your weapon mods are doing by 30%, so that is fantastic. If you have a full set of these on, then you are going to get 50%. The reason why right now I have on the Elder Headdress is due to the last thing I was doing. I was facing a boss, and I use a lot of Dragon Hearts as my secondary healing after bleed. And because I know I'm going to use a lot of Dragon Hearts in certain boss fights, I like to throw on one piece of the Elder set so that it gives me a 1 in 4 chance of not consuming, which in theory would mean for my 10 Dragon Hearts, I'm going to have 2 or 3 that are going to be free. It doesn't really, statistics don't really work like that, but in theory that's what it would mean. However, since I'm not going to be doing a boss at this very moment, I'll just throw on the Labyrinth Helm, and you'll see that now my weapon mod damage is up to 50%. Oh, and it also refunds 10%, which means of your mod power, which means that you're not starting from 0 on any weapon mod after it's depleted, after it's used up. So it allows you to get that back a little faster. Now, if you look here, so when I threw that helm on, we were at 422 damage in 2020, I believe, in effects. Sorry, the bleeding damage. Now we're at 2340 for bleeding and 487.5 for the initial skewer hit. So that's even better. And this works out well. So we've got gear, we've got the weapons, we've got the necklace and the rings. Gonna move on to traits. Now, traits, simply put, you can't really go wrong with traits for this. You're going to get a lot of traits, to the point where probably close to the time that you finish a campaign run, you're going to have more traits you know what to do with. However, for sake of completeness, let's go into these a little bit. I can do a separate video on where you should be investing your trait points when you start and how those choices should change as you progress. But I'm going to focus on the build. What traits do you want to use for the build? Again, it's hard to go wrong, but there are some choices that are good for this specific build. One of them is going to be Spirit. Now I've seen videos where people don't always advocate Spirit. That's typically going to be because they're not making great use of their mod powers. Obviously, this is a build built around mod power, so I want my mods to proc as often as possible. So I am going to go to 20 trait points into Spirit to increase that power generation by 25%. The next thing you want to put some points into is Tormentor. Tormentor increases the status duration by 30%. So if I were to take this off, which I cannot show you, but if I were to take it off, you would notice that the time that the swarm is active is going to be decreased. Sorry, the time that the bleeding is active is going to be decreased. So this allows things to bleed longer, which is fantastic. Continuing down here, what you're going to find is the next one that's going to be really good to use is Arcane Strike. This is saying that you increase your mod power generation on every melee hit, not just charge attacks, but every melee hit. Right now I have 15. Let's go up to 17 on this since I have 2 more points. So I'm at 21.25 now. I suppose that must get to 25 when it's all done. So melee hits increase your mod power generation by 25%. And Spirit increases your mod power generation by 25%. So if you're doing melee, you have double the power you're going to be able to use your mod again. So that is great. And going down, there's a status mod power generation. That's up to 40%. That is fantastic. And what Catalyst does, it increases the mod power generation when attacking an enemy with an active status effect. So that means if I have bleed on somebody, or if I have the swarm's corrosive on somebody, this is going to increase my mod power generation by 40%. If I am, and with a 25% from Spirit, that means I'm getting 65% during that time. And if I happen to be using in melee, that's another 25%. So my mods are going to be coming up for use very quickly. And the last two I'm going to cover are Concentration and Flashcaster. Concentration is going to increase the duration, which is good. More bleed time, more swarm time. Flashcaster, however, it might be something that I use when I don't know what else to put my trait points into. But if you think about it, Swarm, for instance, has a cast time of probably 2.5 seconds. This, if you put 20 points in Flashcaster, you can get up to about 25% casting speed bonus. That means if I have a cast time of 2 seconds, I now have a cast time of 1.5 seconds. In my opinion, that is a negligible difference. Certainly not worth putting 20 points into. Not when you still have other things that you haven't filled out that you are more interested in. So there you go. There is a walkthrough of the build, a walkthrough of how it works. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go look at this in action.